Hi, welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video we're going to learn the 1 to 4 player game Robinson Crusoe Adventures on the Cursed Island, designed by Ignacy Duchevicek and published by Portal Games. When your ship sank, you thought all was lost, but then your hand clutched sand and you realized you were on a deserted island. Or at least you think it's deserted, but there's no time to find out because a storm is coming, you need to make a shelter and then find a way off this patch of land and back to civilization. So join me at the table and let's learn how to play. To set up, place this board in the middle of the table. The game comes with 7 different scenarios on these double-sided sheets, and for your first game they suggest using this one titled Castaways. Place it nearby and then put this wooden round marker onto the first space here. Each player now takes a character, either by choice or randomly. I'll choose to remove this one since we're setting up for a 3-player game. Each character has their own 4 special abilities, but aside from the gender pictured here, each board is identical on both sides. Players then take 2 matching colored discs in either blue, yellow, black, or orange. The game also comes with stickers if you want to permanently personalize these. This is a wound marker which you'll put on the space here, and also note on this side the character's listed invention. From this deck of double-sided cards, find the one listed for each player and put it with this side face up beside their personal board. From all the rest of the inventions, including those for characters not currently in play, find the 9 that have these arrows by their names and in any order, place them in the spaces here. Then take a black disc and place it on this symbol found on the shovel. Later, we'll learn why this is done. Shuffle all remaining inventions, drawing 5 more to place into the spaces here, and then set the rest in a deck nearby. This is the morale track. Place a white disc onto the 0. Now place black discs at the top of, but not into the tracks, of these 4 areas. You'll find 3 decks with backs that have a color and symbol matching the ones found here on the board. Shuffle each and place them in the indicated areas, and underneath put the 3 matching colored dice for each of those sections. These are the island tiles, and one of them you'll find is double-sided, which you'll place with this side face up here on the board. On top of it, put this double-sided camp token with the X face up, and the rest of the island tiles you can shuffle and put nearby. The cards with this back you shuffle, dealing 2 face up near the players, putting 1 white disc on each of their spaces, and then placing the rest of the deck face down nearby. You'll find 3 cards with this back. Among them, find the one called Food Crates, put it in the space here, and return the other 2 to the box. These are the event cards, and you'll want to sort them into 2 face-up piles. One should have all the events with a book symbol in this area, and the other should have all of those with a question mark symbol. Shuffle each pile separately and deal a number of cards from each equal to half the number of rounds in your scenario rounded up. The Castaways scenario that we're using here shows at most you'll have 12 rounds, and that's why we've dealt out 6 from each deck. The undealt cards you can return to the box, shuffling those remaining into a single pile. You'll then place these here face down on the board. These are the Beast and Mystery decks, which you shuffle separately and then place near the board, along with these randomly sorted face-down discovery tokens. You'll also set aside an area for the weather dice, various resources, wooden discs, and other tokens that you might use during the game. If you have 4 players, put this card right here, and if you have only 1 or 2 players, there are also some extra rules for using Friday and the dog token, but I'll leave those for you to discover on your own. Now give the youngest player this first player token. And I should mention, for the purposes of this video and being able to move things around as I need to, I'll be placing many of these extra components off screen and just bringing them out as required. And that's the setup. In Robinson Crusoe, players will be working together to survive and try to complete their chosen scenario, all the while making decisions between working on things like their shelter, the weapons they have, hunting beasts, fighting off infections, preparing for bad weather, creating inventions, exploring the island, and a variety of other things, including just trying to keep morale up and not die. The game is played over a series of rounds that are broken into 6 phases each. You'll find these pictured here, starting with the event phase, which is actually skipped for the first round of the game, but I'll come back and explain it before the video is over. So we'll now move on to the second item, the morale phase. Here, the first player checks to see where this marker is on the morale track. If it's at 0, then nothing happens, but if it's anywhere to the right, that player will gain a certain number of these determination tokens, as indicated by this symbol. If the marker is on the furthest space, then they choose to either gain 2 determination or heal 1 wound. During the game, your character may suffer wounds, which is commonly shown by this symbol. When you take a wound, you move this marker on your board 1 heart to the right. Sometimes there may be an arrow between 2 hearts. For example, if our marker was here and we took another wound, we would jump directly to here. Moving over one of these arrows reduces the morale of the camp by 1. If you ever get so many wounds that this marker reaches the skull here, then your character dies and the players lose the game. Anytime you heal a wound, you move the marker 1 space to the left. If this would ever cause you to cross over an arrow, it is ignored and the morale is not adjusted. Certain card effects may instruct you to gain a wound to a specific part of your body. Instead of adjusting the wound track, it will show a token to collect and where to place it on your character's portrait. These wounds cannot be healed like wounds on the track. Instead, the game will tell you later if and how the token can be removed. Going back to the morale track, if the marker is instead to the left of the 0, the first player must discard that number of determination tokens, and these have to come from their personal collection. If you would ever need to discard determination tokens you don't have, then for each that you cannot return to the supply, you'll suffer 1 wound. And you must always pay with tokens if you have them. You can't choose to suffer wounds instead. Also note that morale cannot be reduced below this level or raised beyond this one. Now before we move on to the next phase, let's stop and talk a bit about these determination tokens and how they can be used once gained. First, I should mention that players can never trade these with each other. Instead, the ones that you gain can only be used by your character, but they can be spent anytime after you have them. Each character has 4 unique special abilities listed here that can be used at any time unless it indicates otherwise. And to use an ability, you spend the required determination tokens and then place a black disc on it. This acts as a reminder that that ability cannot be used again this round. Each ability is explained on the character board itself, but if you have any questions about how they work exactly, you can find that detailed here in the appendix at the back of the rulebook. But now let's go back to the phases of a round. First, we had the event and morale phases, but now we're moving on to the production phase. On the island tiles you've discovered, you'll see certain symbols within squares. The fish, or in some cases the bird symbol, both represent food, while logs represent wood. On the tile that contains your camp token, during the production phase, you'll gain 1 food and/or wood for each of those symbols found on it. So in this case, we'd gain 1 food as well as 1 wood, both represented by these resource tokens. These are now placed in the dark bottom half of this crate. This area is known as the available resources space, and it will contain things that any player can use during the round. Sometimes items will go into this top area, known as the future resources space, and those things cannot be used, at least not yet. Next, it's the action phase, and this is divided into 2 steps, planning and resolving. Each player has 2 action pawns, and during the planning step, you must assign both unless an effect is preventing you, but you'll always have at least 1 to use. You may also have some neutral pawns like these, but using them is always optional. Your pawns are not assigned in turns. Instead, you'll work together to decide how best to place them. And sometimes an action will require 2 pawns, and these can come from more than 1 player, as we'll see. But for now, let me take you on a tour of all the different places your pawns can be assigned. Any cards found in this area are known as threats, and they will show on this bottom half the number of pawns required to satisfy it. In this case, we could place either 1 or 2 pawns. Other threats, like this one, or even other action spaces, may have additional requirements you need to satisfy. For example, this threat requires 1 pawn and 1 wood. When a resource is needed, it must be in this lower available resources area. Again, any resources in this upper area cannot be used at this time. And to prevent mistakes from being made, you must move the required resources to the area where you're planning to take your action. Once assigned like this, even though the action has not yet been resolved, any resources there are no longer available for other uses. Sometimes a requirement just needs something else to be in play. As an example, to plan to handle this threat, you need to have one pawn and a weapon level, which is indicated here, of at least 2. You won't need to change anything on this track. As long as you have at least a value of 2, in this case we have 3, then you're fine. You don't need to adjust anything, and other actions can still also use this weapon level when they resolve. To plan a hunt, you must place 2 pawns here. However, you cannot hunt unless you have at least 1 card already in this deck area. And we'll see how these get added a little bit later. Some actions, like this one, can be planned with either 1 or 2 pawns assigned to it. When placing 2 together, you should stack one on top of the other. If a pawn is placed alone, or it's the one on top of a stack, these are both considered the resolving characters, while the one underneath, if any, is the supporting character. As an aside, if a character's ability says that it can only be used during your action, it means that that ability can only be resolved during an action in which that character is the resolving one. As a tip, I should also point out that if there are any consequences when resolving an action later, only the resolving character is affected. So putting a severely wounded character in the supporting role gains the benefit of their support without exposing them to any risk. I should also point out that unless specified otherwise, all actions can be performed more than once. And you show this by placing pawns beside each other rather than stacking them all in one pile. So in this case, if we wanted to hunt 2 beasts, we could by assigning 2 stacks of 2 pawns beside each other here. Keeping in mind there'd also need to be at least 2 beasts to hunt as well. During the game, you may also gain some neutral action pawns. These don't necessarily represent other characters so much as new skills or tools that you have to use to make your actions more efficient. And they can only be used with actions that match their color. So for example, this neutral pawn can only be used to hunt. It's also important to note that neutral pawns can only be used for support, so they must always be assigned with and under a player character. Another action is building, which can be attempted with either 1 or 2 pawns. Placing only 1 pawn means that you're rushing the job and there's a chance that you'll fail, but if you place 2 pawns, it means you're taking your time, guaranteeing that the task will succeed. When doing this action, you don't place the pawns in this area. In fact, they'll be placed in different areas around the board. For example, to build a shelter, roof, or palisade, you need to place 1 or 2 pawns on their specific area. However, the roof or palisade cannot be assigned pawns until the round after the shelter has been successfully built. Or if you have your camp token on an island tile with a natural shelter, which is this symbol shown right here. Along with the pawns that you assign, there'll be some additional costs, but for each of these it's always the same. It's just based on the number of players you have. For example, if you have 3 players, then you need to either take 3 wood or 2 pelts from your available resources and put them here with your pawns. You may also work on improving your weapon by placing 1 or 2 workers here and assigning 1 wood for each of those build actions. Just as a reminder, by assigning only 1 worker, I'm attempting this with some risk of failure. But if I stack 2 workers together, I know the task will succeed. Or I could put them side by side as 2 separate actions, knowing that each could potentially fail. Or even add a 3rd action. The cards here are inventions that you can attempt to build with their cost shown in these upper dark areas. Some of them may actually require you to have discovered certain types of land on the island before you can attempt to build them. For example, the shovel here requires you to have first found a beach area, which is represented by this symbol. We start the game with a tile showing this beach symbol, so that's why during setup we covered this requirement showing that it's already satisfied. Whereas this pot requires us to first find some hills, which we haven't yet, so we can't attempt to build this. To show we're going to build the shovel, we would assign either 1 or 2 pawns there. Sometimes one invention requires another one. To build the moat, for example, we need to assign 1 wood resource from our available resources, but also have the shovel already invented. And the timing here matters. We can't attempt to build both of these during the same action round, since you always fully need the requirements of any action before you can assign pawns to it. And at this point, we don't actually have a shovel yet. Players also have their own invention by their player board, which requires their action pawn in the resolving position, although another player's pawn can support it. The scenario itself may also have other inventions that you can build, like we see down here, and these you can assign pawns to, again assuming that you can pay the other related costs. Unlike many other actions, only one attempt can be made to build each invention in a single round. For example, we could not assign two separate groups of pawns to try to build this hatchet more than once. The same is true for the shelter. Only one attempt can be made to build it each round, whereas you can assign multiple actions to the roof, palisade, and even upgrading your weapon. Another action you can take is gathering, and for this you can assign either one or two pawns or multiple groups of them. And just like when building, assigning only one pawn means there's a chance you won't succeed, but two guarantees that you will. When gathering, pawns are assigned to a source. These are the small square pictures that you'll find on island tiles. However, each may only produce resources once per round, so you can't gather from your camp tile, as we already gained resources from these during the production phase. Once more tiles have been revealed and added to the board, you can then gather from ones adjacent to your camp like this. You can also gather from tiles that are not adjacent to your camp as long as you're traveling over already explored ones. For each extra tile that you have to pass over to get to your destination, you will need to add an extra pawn to that action. So let's say, for example, I wanted to gather wood from this tile. If I was willing to risk failure, I could just assign one pawn as usual, but then I would need to add one extra pawn for the tile that I had to travel over when leaving my camp. If instead I had wanted to guarantee my success, I would need to place two pawns and then the extra one for the travel. You can also plan for an explore action again by either placing one or two pawns depending on whether or not you want to guarantee success. These can be placed in an empty region adjacent to your camp tile. However, no more than one set of pawns may be assigned to any one unexplored space during the same round. So while this would not be allowed, you can explore more than once as long as it's in different regions. Like gathering, you can also explore further away from your camp as long as you follow an explored path to the empty area that you wish to uncover. Again, using additional pawns for each extra tile passed over. So as an example, we could assign one pawn here, or two if we want to guarantee success. And then we would also need to assign another pawn for this tile that we passed over. Some scenarios will allow you to explore areas on already discovered tiles, which are usually represented by this symbol. Show that you're exploring one of these by putting your pawn there. This is the arrange camp action and requires only one pawn, but more can be placed here as additional actions as usual. And then finally we have the rest action, which also only requires one pawn, though several can be assigned separately. Your scenario may also provide other actions that you can take. To win this one, we need to create a large pile of wood and a source of fire to light it with by the time a ship sails past, which is shown to occur in rounds 10, 11, and 12. The scenario itself will provide you with instructions for how to perform these actions, like creating the wood pile, but those you can learn when you're playing. Remember, available neutral pawns do not need to be used, but character ones must all be placed, and then it's time to resolve actions. These are followed in the same order every time, from left to right, starting with the threats here, and then ending with the rest action, skipping anywhere that pawns have not been assigned. As each action is resolved, return the related pawns to their owners or to the supply, which might be the case when using some neutral pawns. Within an action, if more than one group of pawns has been assigned, players can choose the order in which they're resolved. And we also need to be mindful that when resolving actions, things may change, and some may or may not affect your other actions that round. Right now, let's go over all of the different effects that do have an immediate impact on your actions. For example, if the shelter here is built, then the camp token is immediately flipped over. Changes to your roof, palisade, or weapon level take effect as they occur, potentially impacting future actions. And wounds occur as they happen, which could cause the morale to drop. Also, when instructed, determination tokens are immediately gained or lost. If resources are ever lost, only discard them from this available resources area. This means you never lose any that are already assigned to actions, like this wood here, as these were put to use during the planning step of this phase. If you would ever need to lose something and you can't, whether it's a resource or a level from one of these areas, then you take one wound for each unfulfilled item. During the action phase, only the player resolving an action takes wounds, if any. But other occurrences of unfulfilled costs during other phases cause all characters to suffer one wound. The one case where this isn't true is if your morale is on the final bottom space and needs to be reduced further. In that case, no wounds are suffered. If an effect says you are to lose something if possible, then you suffer no penalty if you can't pay it. Also, as a general rule, if you can pay a cost, you must. You can't choose to take wounds instead. When I said earlier that the results of some actions may change the state of the game and have an impact on future actions that round, do understand that planned actions can't be stopped by the outcomes of other ones that you've already resolved. As an example, if your weapon value dropped even all the way to 0, you may not fight as well during a hunt action that you planned, but you'll still get to resolve that action. Likewise, if an action causes you to lose an invention, like this shovel, that you needed for another action that you had already planned to take, you still resolve the action that you had planned, as this kind of loss will not take effect until the end of the current action phase. Now, all that said, any treasures or inventions that you made, discovery tokens you claimed, or resources collected must all be placed here in the future resources space, where they will not be available to pay for costs or penalties until later. I should also point out that during setup, players gain these random 2 starting equipment items. Unless otherwise stated, each one may be used by any player anytime for their effect. And when used, you remove 1 marker from that equipment. Once both markers are gone, the card can be returned to the box. So now, in order, let's see how each action type is resolved, starting with this threat area, which can have at most 2 cards on it. Each threat may only be resolved once, meaning you can't place multiple sets of pawns on a single card. And when a threat has pawns assigned to it along with any other required costs, as shown here, you now remove them, gaining the listed benefit, and then you discard the threat. This ensures that it will not be forced off the board in a later event phase, which, when that happens, would cause this negative effect to occur. By resolving the threat and removing it, now you know that won't happen. At the start of the game, a special wreckage event is placed here, and unlike normal threats, these will have no negative consequence when they leave the board. The hunt action can gain you food and pelts, but without a high enough weapon to fight the beast you encounter here, you may suffer wounds. And remember, you may only take this action if there are already beast cards in this area. When resolving the hunt, the topmost beast is drawn, and then combat is resolved. And combat can occur in other ways outside of this action, but it's always resolved the same way, and then once completed, regardless of the outcome, the beast is removed from play. To resolve combat, first compare the strength of the beast to your current weapon level. Strength is shown with this black skull symbol, so the wild pig is a strength of 3, and our weapon is at level 2. If your level is lower than the strength of the beast, the resolving player suffers wounds equal to the difference. But keep in mind, you might have treasures or other equipment you could use to temporarily boost your weapon level. For example, if I wanted to fire a round from my pistol, I could temporarily gain 3. This would give me a total of 5, and then I wouldn't suffer any wounds. But I think I'd rather save this effect for a more dangerous beast, so we'll leave things the way they are. Regardless of whether you took a wound or not, now the actual weapon value on the board, ignoring any temporary boost you may have, is then reduced by the value with the white skull, so -1 in this case. If it's not possible to fully reduce your weapon level by the amount required, the resolving player suffers a wound for each level that is not paid. So if we'd gone into this combat with a weapon strength of 0, first of all, we would have taken 3 damage because of the beast's strength, and then because we couldn't reduce our weapon value, we would have taken another damage. Again, regardless of what has happened so far, you'll now gain an amount of food and number of pelts as indicated here. So in this case, 3 food and 1 pelt. Remember, these will be placed in the future resource area. Some beasts may provide benefits or other negative effects that now need to be resolved. If those include any costs that need to be paid, but you can't, then again, you'll resolve a wound for each. Sometimes the game will simply require you to do combat against a beast with a strength of 3, which is what this symbol represents. In those cases, you'll resolve the fight in the same way, ignoring all factors except for its strength. Even if you took wounds or had no weapon level, as long as you didn't die, which would cause you to end the game, then combat is always considered a successful action once it's completed. In the case of a hunt, once it's over, you can then remove the beast from the game, and players can take back their action pawns. Next is the build action, and with these, you may be working on a shelter, your roof, palisade, weapon levels, or trying to turn an invention into a usable item. If 2 pawns were assigned to the action, it succeeds. However, if only 1 pawn was assigned, then it may fail. Resolving build, gather, and explore actions with only 1 pawn always works the same way. First, you take and roll the 3 dice that match that action's color. For building, it's the 3 brown ones, and they're known as the wound, success, and adventure dice. If you roll a wound, then the resolving character suffers 1 wound. If you roll this symbol on the success die, then the action is successful. So if you were trying to build a shovel, then the shovel has been built. If you roll this symbol instead, then the action fails, but the character gains 2 determination tokens. On the adventure die, if a question mark is rolled, you draw and reveal the top card of the matching colored adventure deck. Now resolve its top half. In this case, we were told we received a nasty wound while attempting to build something, and then typically you're told to shuffle the card into this event deck. If it's later drawn out, you'll then resolve this bottom half, which narratively represents the outcome of this earlier incident. Take a wound while you're trying to build something, you might suffer an infection later on. Sometimes you might have an ability that lets you re-roll dice. If this opportunity is gained by spending determination tokens, then you must do that immediately after rolling, but before resolving any of the dice. Whether by assigning 2 pawns or by rolling this symbol, if you only assigned 1 pawn, when an action succeeds, any resources or determination tokens assigned to it are then discarded. But if the action failed, resources are instead returned to this available resources area, and any determination tokens that might have been assigned through an ability but weren't used are then returned to its character. If you succeed in building the shelter, move the black disc here to show that and immediately flip this token to its shelter side. Remember, it's only after you build a shelter, or if your token had been on a space with a natural shelter, that you'll be able to start building the roof and palisade levels on future rounds. So that's why we were also able to assign a worker here, because during the planning step, we were on a space with a natural shelter. If an effect would cause you to gain roof or palisade levels, and you have no shelter, constructed or natural, you ignore those effects. Successfully building a roof or palisade increases its value on these related tracks by moving the disc up by 1. And there's really no upper limit. So if you exceed the number on the bottom row, add additional discs to keep track of this. Here we'd be saying we had a level of 6. The weapon level advances the same way when it's built. When an invention is built, it is placed into the future resources space with this invention side still face up. The same is true when a character's personal invention is successfully built, but that player also gains 2 determination tokens, as you're reminded of here. Special inventions on the scenario mat obviously can't be moved once built, so instead place a marker on them to indicate that they have been completed, and then they'll be available at the end of the current action phase to be used in future rounds. After the build action, you'll resolve the gather actions, and these succeed when 2 pawns are used and you gain the resource pictured here. Remember, both the parrot and the fish will provide you with 1 food resource, and this is placed into the future resource area. If only 1 pawn is assigned, resolve it as we saw with building by rolling the dice. In this case, we rolled a success, and we would gain 1 wood. If the tile you're gathering from contains either of these tokens, and you're gathering that specific resource from the island tile, you'll gain 1 extra, so in this case, we would collect 2 wood. Sometimes a source can be exhausted, which means it's covered with a black disc. And in those cases, even if there's another token there, you cannot gather any of that resource. Moving on to the Explore action, we also know that it's successful if 2 pawns are used, or if only 1 pawn is used and the success result is rolled. If successful, draw the topmost tile from the stack and place it face up on the explored region. Take note of the terrain type found here, and then, assuming they're not already covered, place a black disc on all matching terrain types of unbuilt inventions. If this beast symbol is on the newly explored tile, then add the top beast unseen from this deck to the hunt area. And if there were already cards there, be sure to shuffle them all together. If you see this totem symbol, then check the scenario for any related effects that might need to be resolved. This is the symbol for discovery tokens. For each one shown, draw 1 and place it face up into the future resources area. We know this symbol means that the location has a natural shelter. So if your camp token has been moved there, roof and palisade levels can now be built, even if a shelter has not yet been constructed. The next action to resolve is arranging camp. This represents taking care of your living space and helping to raise morale. So each pawn placed here raises morale by 1, and each of those characters gain 2 determination tokens. With 4 players, this card is used here instead, requiring each pawn assigned to this action to choose either to collect 2 determination tokens for their character, or to increase morale by 1. The final action is resting. Each pawn placed here heals that character's wounds by 1. But keep in mind, this will not remove wounds placed on specific character body parts. After resolving all the actions, move any resources from the futures area to the available space. Then move down all discovery tokens where they'll remain until used, unless they specifically show either 1 wood or 2 food, in which case they must be exchanged for right away. You'll find details for how all other discovery tokens can be used in the appendix of the rulebook. Now apply the effects of any inventions found here. For example, the moat would now increase your palisade level by 2. Assuming we had a shelter of some type, we would make this adjustment. Then flip the invention to the item side, placing it on the board with the other items and inventions. While showing this side face up, the invention is considered constructed, and any other inventions or abilities that would take advantage of it are now satisfied. We'll see later that you may also gain treasures that are placed in the futures area, and these would be resolved now and then discarded, unless they have a future or ongoing ability, in which case you would just place them beside the board as a reminder. Before moving on to the next phase, we should go over a few more rules related to actions. For example, during the game, an effect may force you to flip items back to their unbuilt side. But that item is still considered available during that round if it was part of a planned action. For example, we needed that rope to work on this shield, and we can still do this. But during the next round, the rope will be considered destroyed, and we'd need to rebuild it again if we wanted to use it further. If it was a character's personal invention that was destroyed, place it back beside them, and it can be rebuilt later, which will once again gain them the 2 determination tokens shown here. If an item you are removing had a positive effect, it must be reverted as much as possible. For example, if we were to lose the moat, then we would need to reduce the palisade level by 2. If you can't reduce it as much as is required, that's okay, no additional penalty is caused. Sometimes when assigning pawns during the planning step of the action phase, there will be tokens on an area that were placed by previous effects. These require special treatment unless they were played during that specific action phase. Then they only become active after the action phase in which they were placed. For example, this is a reroll token. If it's on an action space, when the success is rolled on the success die, then it must be re-rolled and then the token is discarded. That said, if the initial roll of that action was not a success, then this token remains in place and applies to the next action roll of that type. This is the greater danger token. If it's on a hunt space, the next beast that is fought has its strength increased by 1, and then this token is discarded. If this token is on the island tile with your camp token, then actions performed within the camp, which include building inventions, arranging camp, and resting, require a weapon level of at least 1 or a wound is suffered when those actions are taken. If it's instead on an island tile other than the camp, the weapon level must be at least 1 for all actions pawns would take there, or the character resolving that action suffers 1 wound. In either case, the token is not discarded. This is a time-consuming token. When on an action location, an extra pawn is required to perform the first action planned there, and then it's discarded. So for example, if I wanted to build this spear and I wasn't concerned about guaranteeing success, I would normally only place 1 pawn, but because of this token, I would now need to place a second one. If this token is on the tile with the camp, it affects only build, arrange camp, and rest actions there. When on a tile other than the camp one, all actions there require an additional pawn, and in both cases, the token remains in place. These are the additional food and wood tokens. If this is on an action space, then an additional wood resource must be assigned to the first action there that requires wood. If the action is successful, then the token is removed. But if unsuccessful, it remains in place for the next wood-related action. If the token is on any one of these 4 areas here, 1 additional wood must be assigned anytime that specific feature is being built using wood. Keeping in mind, if you're building using pelts, you don't have to pay an additional wood piece. That said, either way, this token is not discarded when these spaces are used. When the extra food token is in this night phase space, each character must eat one additional food during the night phase, and for each that they don't, they'll suffer one wound. Then this token is discarded. If any of these adventure tokens are on top of their matching adventure deck, an adventure card must be drawn the next time an action of that type is resolved, even if you assign 2 pawns to it. If you only assigned 1 pawn, and therefore had to roll the dice, even if a question mark comes up, you'll still only draw 1 card from the top of this deck, and in either case, this token is then discarded. With the action phase fully explained, now let's move on to phase number 5, known as weather, which is represented here on the board. The scenario will dictate how many and which dice are rolled during this phase. For example, here, no dice are rolled until we get to round 4, where the orange dice will then be used going forward until we get to round 7, and then all 3 dice will be rolled from that point forward. Sometimes weather tokens may have been placed in this space, and if so, even if no weather die are due to be rolled, these are resolved anyway. No matter which dice were rolled or tokens used, first count the number of these snow symbols, which in this case is a total of 3, and for each, 1 wood must be discarded. However, we only have 2 to remove. For each one that we did not pay, each player in camp suffers 1 wound. Now add up all of these rain symbols showing. In this case, we have 2, and add those to the snow symbols for a grand total of 5, and compare this to your current roof level, which we have here at 4. If these weather symbols exceed the roof level, for each point of this, 1 wood and 1 food must be discarded. We do have the food to remove, but not the wood. And again, each character suffers 1 wound per required resource that cannot be removed. If the hungry animal die had been rolled, it must also be resolved. With this result, 1 food must be removed. Or if you're showing this symbol, the palisade level must be reduced by 1. If this side is showing, then you must resolve combat against a Strength 3 beast. If the weapon level is less than 3, each character suffers 1 wound for each missing level. I should mention that if a card effect would ever require you to roll this die right now, and the scenario was already requiring you to roll it as well, then it's only rolled once. Finally, check to see if this storm token had been in the weather space, and if so, the palisade level must be decreased by 1. If it can't be, again, each player suffers 1 wound. And then, at the end of the weather phase, all weather tokens are discarded. Finally, we move on to the night phase, and here, players may heal by using treasures, discovery tokens, and even items that they've created. But these cannot be used earlier in the round to heal yourself, so this is the time to do it. To finish the night phase, you must now perform the following steps. First, characters must eat by each discarding either 1 perishable or 1 non-perishable food. This symbol, which represents the perishable goods, is what we've seen most often, and this is the most common types of food that you'll gather. But some items or other effects may also provide you with non-perishable food that looks like this bread slice. Either can be eaten, but we'll see the benefits of non-perishable foods in just a moment. We have 3 players in our game, so we need to discard these 3 food items. Any player who does not eat must take 2 wounds. And if there's a decision to be made, players can decide together which characters won't eat. Now you may decide whether or not to move your camp token to an adjacent tile. If you already built a shelter, it can be moved, but you must reduce your roof and palisade by half. So in this case, the roof would drop from 4 to 2, and the palisade would go from 3 to 1.5, but then you'd round up in your favor and move it to 2. If you only had a natural shelter instead, then moving reduces any roof or palisade you had to 0. There are a few extra rules around moving a camp, but these tend to be related to certain items you might have in play, and are probably best learned when you encounter them yourself, so I'll leave those for you to discover on your own. After deciding whether or not to move your camp token, if you don't have a shelter on your tile, each character suffers 1 wound. Now all perishable food, if you have not found a way to store it, for example by using an invention that you've created, must now be discarded. And that's why non-perishable food can be so attractive. If you can find that, you know at the very least it will not go rotten at the end of a round. Then all markers on characters' special abilities are removed, and the marker on the scenario sheet is moved to the next round, and the first player token is passed clockwise. Some effects from an action may force a character to spend the night phase outside of camp. In that case, all of the things that they gain from that specific action are available only to them and are placed on their player sheet. A character who is outside of camp ignores weather effects. However, if the tile they are on does not have a natural shelter, they suffer 1 wound in the night phase, and if they don't have food to eat amongst the items on their sheet, they also take 2 wounds. You then return to camp at the start of the following round, and all resources you still have are placed in the available area. We've referred to treasures in this video, and they come from these mystery cards, which can also contain creatures and traps. At times, you may be instructed to draw some combination of these things. For example, the effect of Remains of a Settlement gives us the option to draw until we've resolved up to 1 trap and 2 treasures. To do this, you'll reveal cards from this deck, setting them aside if they're not one of the chosen types. In this case, we reveal the creature, so we'll set it aside here. The next card I draw is a treasure, so this will be placed in the Future Resources area. Now I can choose to keep drawing as I'm allowed to continue until I have a total, again, of 2 treasures and 1 trap. But I can also stop now to ensure I don't have to resolve a trap. Let's say I decide to continue. If I find a trap, which is this type here, then it's resolved right away. I'll then remove it from the game. Now again, I can stop or continue, but since I know I can only resolve treasures from now on, I may as well continue. In this case, another trap, which I can ignore because I already resolved 1 trap. And hey, there's another treasure, so this I'll put in the Future Resources area. Once I'm finished, I then shuffle all set-aside cards back into the deck. Before wrapping up, remember that in the first round, this event phase was skipped. So now let's take a look at how it's resolved in all future rounds. Here, the first player draws the top card of this deck. Now, there's only event cards in it to begin with, but remember, adventure and sometimes even mystery cards can get shuffled in. If a mystery card is drawn, then read it aloud and resolve it. Then discard that card and draw a new one. If it's an adventure card like this, read aloud the bottom half and resolve it. This card is then also discarded. This may require you to draw and resolve several cards before getting to an actual event card, which will have this kind of back. When you do draw an event, follow these steps. First, read its name and the italic story text. If there's a colored adventure icon, put its matching colored token on the corresponding adventure deck. If that deck already has one, then this can be ignored. If instead the symbol showing here is a book, like on this event, then apply the book symbol effect on the scenario sheet, if any. Now continue by resolving the event's effect, which is shown here just above the middle. Then place it into the right-hand space of this threat area. If there's already an event there, then remove it and put it into the left-hand space, and if there's a threat there, you'll discard it. But first you'll need to resolve this threat text, which currently says that we need to reduce our roof or palisade level by 1. Any cost that you cannot pay when resolving a threat cause 1 wound to each character. Unless the threat is reducing morale like this one and it's already at 0, then you don't suffer any additional penalties. If an event forces combat to occur, resolve it as usual, but the first player must do it and suffer all of the consequences alone. Also, any cards not pushed by other ones can just stay where they are. For example, after resolving this event, if the space here had been empty, this would just move in and this one would stay put. It should also be noted that any resources gained during the event phase are sent directly to the available resources area. Rounds will continue until you fulfill the scenario's goals, causing the players to win, or as soon as a character dies, causing the players to lose. You also lose if the last round of the scenario finishes before the game's goals are completed, or if the camp shelter token ends up on a tile that becomes inaccessible. We've covered a lot of rules in this video, and there are some extra ones on these pages to clarify special terms, 2-player and solo variants, along with an appendix for each scenario and several card effects in case you need further information. But I think it's best that I leave that for you to discover on your own when those situations arrive, as you may not even encounter those in certain scenarios. If you don't have the game yet and would like to look at some of these additional rules, I'll help by putting a link in the description of this video to a PDF document of this exact rulebook. You may also find it helpful to put the back of the rulebook face up on the table because it has all of the symbols that you'll encounter in the game on it, along with their definitions. The game also includes this round summary sheet, and this can be helpful to remind you the different steps of completing a round. Did you make it to the end of this video? If you did, congratulate yourself in the comments below because you deserve it. Well done. There was a lot here to absorb, but hopefully you'll find it pretty easy to follow once you sit down and start playing your own games. If you have any questions though, feel free to put them in the comments below and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. But until the next episode, thanks for watching.